Hey everyone, Dan here. Please remember to subscribe, share, and hit that like button. Also, you want to check out more of my work? Then head on over to my website, dansden.net. Anyway, this is a buckling up that I'm not sure you'll get any actual laughs out of. Formed out of the ashes of two channels known as HAW and the Comedy Channel, Comedy Central as we know it was established in 1991. The station quickly grew into becoming cable's premier place for 24 hours of non-stop classic comedy material, eventually airing its own original programming. Some of these shows you might have heard of, like South Park and The Daily Show. That's not what we're here to talk about, though. The thing to know about a 24-hour network, particularly back in the 1990s or 2000s, is that it just can't rest its laurels on reruns of the exact same television shows 24/7, no matter how popular they may be. There has to be something else to fill in the remaining time slots. What are you going to do during the period where parents are likely to be at work, kids are at school, and the only people back at home are either a friend visiting or a member of the family who might be unemployed? Well, aside from the obvious reruns, you might play movies. So, Comedy Central being a comedy channel, what kinds of films are they going to play? Well, what else but comedies? Comedy Central was owned by Viacom, which eventually acquired Paramount Studios. You'd think then that they would primarily play movies from that library, but oh, it was so much more than that. The station initially played classic older movies like Way Out West, Laurel and Hardy, and Monty Python's, and now for something completely different as their big event features. For many people who didn't have giant cable channels like HBO, and with something like TCM having not yet quite been established, this was about the only way you could watch many of these classic comedies, while randomly surfing the television. Eventually the station would primarily settle on playing movies from the time period you might expect, the 80s and above. The big movies were treated like the classics they were: Ghostbusters, Dodgeball, Freddy Got Fingered, all the essentials. They aired in Comedy Central at one point or another, usually 8 p.m. at night, complete with big promos and booking segments. In between these blockbusters though, Comedy Central's afternoon movie schedule featuring lesser films got rather diverse, let's just say. See, when big companies agree to send channels movies their way, not every film is going to be a classic, a so-called diamond in the rough. This is especially true with comedy, which has a lot of low-grade, low-quality, less successful stuff. The worst comedy is inherently just the worst, because if there isn't anything actually resembling jokes, there isn't much in the way of actual entertainment. When you're not laughing, that's not a great feeling. It makes more sense to air these types of drags at a time when people are less likely to be at home. If they are at home, they're bored and they have nothing better to do. Thus, watching TV turns into more of a matter of convenience for them. In the case of Comedy Central, when they're searching what to play in the early morning or mid-afternoon time slots, they had plenty of options. Not every play was bad though. Some that aired during random time periods that weren't 8 p.m. could be considered minor classics, depending on who you ask. The channel would, for example, regularly play all the Cheech and Chong movies, sometimes at 10 a.m. and sometimes in the afternoon. These movies get worse as they go along. Up in Smoke is the only one that can be categorized as being essential viewing. This was, however, also around the same time they started reading books about comedy and film. So in a way it was sort of secretly important that I ended up seeing these movies that often get referenced in these books in segmented bits. Comedy Central was also the channel that really brought Office Space to my attention. I had rented the film beforehand, but I didn't really start to appreciate it until I kept seeing it on Comedy Central, which allowed me to start picking up all the little jokes and details that I'd missed beforehand. But outside of those movies that might be familiar to an audience at large, there was the really, really weird stuff. The movies that were likely to be exclusive to Comedy Central and Comedy Central only. Many of the movies could be described as subpar or even abysmal, but I saw them so many times when I was younger, I remember so many little moments from them, which is really more than I can say about the majority of films I watched. These movies can affectionately be called Comedy Central film staples because the network went full tilt tap for them, constantly airing them all the time and at any point. They're either small movies or semi-straight to DVD obscure features this time to come from a semi-major or even a major studio. These were the kinds of films that if you asked local John down the street, "Hey, did you see that blank movie on TV yesterday?" he'd say, "I've never even heard of that," and start accusing you of making up names. Movies like Good Advice with Charlie Sheen pre-Two and a Half Men near the nadir of his almost washed-up career, where he plays an investment banker who winds up losing everything. Somehow I've seen the opening of this film 4 times, and I'm not exactly proud of it. The satirical Last Shot with Matthew Broderick and Alec Baldwin, where a director gets involved with the mob and makes a phony film as a sting operation. I know some people who swear by this film, but does anyone actually remember it? I saw it in Comedy Central so many times that to me, it might as well have been one of the biggest movies ever made. Or what about the otherwise extremely forgettable 1990 movie Madhouse with John Larroquette and Kirstie Alley? I'll admit I probably skimmed through bits and pieces of this movie more times than some of the obvious classics. Hey, the Angry Mob, put down those pitchforks for a second. Then there was the infamous Soul Chris Kattan star vehicle Corgi Romano. This film is actually considerably worse than any of the 3 films I highlighted, but because it was on Comedy Central again and again, before I learned the difference between a good and a bad film, it has some nostalgic appeal to me. Though I won't defend the film today. It's pretty awful. It is interesting in the context of how much Comedy Central seemed to love playing it. It was also through Comedy Central's repetition of films that I was able to discover a number of John Candy starring vehicles that I only knew vaguely. As a performer, I first discovered Candy through my dad because of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Then from there I wanted to watch Spaceballs and Uncle Buck. Candy quickly became one of my favorite performers, comedic or otherwise. However, there are a number of John Candy movies that you had to experience for the first time in full. That is until they kept showing up on Comedy Central over and over. In particular, at one point, it felt like the channel would play Candy's last 2 movies, the not very good Wagons East, and the much more mixed but ultimately failed Michael Moore-directed satire, Canadian Bacon, every other day. Because of the frequency of these airings, I used to make jokes about Wagons East's status as a Comedy Central favorite. Sometimes the channel would do themed afternoon movie showings. I remember seeing that Dreadful Caddyshack 2 was on, and I didn't know what it was at first glance, so I went onto their website to see what it was all about. They had a whole write-up about how they were showing it as part of a run of weekly movies, where they spotlighted underrated sequels. I don't recall the other films they played, but I was positive even then that I didn't agree with the idea of Caddyshack 2 being underappreciated or underrated. The number of movies that aired on Comedy Central over the years could probably be classified as having been in the thousands, so it would be too much of a burden for me to go through every single film, detail by detail. Fortunately, on their website, specifically the older version, there was actually a way to see all of the movies that were scheduled to air on the channel. This is where I have a distinct memory of, for some reason, seeing Kenneth Branagh as Henry V listed as having played on the network at one point. Yeah, because Shakespeare tragedies are inherently hilarious. Now, when you go to the Comedy Central website, you don't get anything about the actual scheduled features. There is, however, a section for Comedy Central original movies. Yeah, like all cable channels of its ilk, Comedy Central eventually went on to make original cable TV movies. They haven't made many, I counted about 7 in total, but they do play an important part in the station's history. The first of their original cable movies actually dates back to the 2002 film Porn and Chicken, a movie that asked the daring question, what if you made American Pie, but worse, with more obnoxious characters, typical bad female roles, and with none of the stuff that actually makes the original work, i.e. the heart. I watched this movie for this video just to get a bit of a taste test, and to be frank, I don't think I'll be coming back for seconds. The dialogue is swarming with that annoying element of obvious metaphors, masquerading as dirty jokes. Really, it's not hard to see why this one has not been all that fondly remembered. Given that Porn and Chicken was heavily marketed as being Comedy Central's first original film, it might be surprising it took them so long to make another follow-up. In recent years, though, perhaps due to the decline in TV viewership, the channel decided to start embracing the TV feature more. Comedy Central original movies like Hot Mess Holiday, A Clusterfunk Christmas, Out of Office, Cursed Friends, and Office Race are all very reminiscent of the type of subpar features, often made on cheap budgets, that the channel air in the afternoon or morning, complete with predictable jokes that more often than not don't really land. At the same time, they don't seem to scratch the same sort of itch as actual older movies airing on the channel before would. And maybe that comes down to a difference in the modern sensibilities of comedy and comedy pacing. Most movies that played on Comedy Central were very bad, no good, lowbrow comedies, often fitting the ideal of what might think as being the worst of the worst. They remind me of those really awful straight-to-DVD National Lampoon movies from the 2000s. You know, when the brand would agree to license name to anything, which not so coincidentally, Comedy Central had a handful of. Yeah, many of these movies were playing the same sort of biggest cheap seats possible, bottom-of-the-barrel humor. A lot of times, there was no real regard for quality, but I did take these features on their own terms back then. It helps that these movies actually turned out to play a pivotal evolution in my own sense of humor. They were often lesser films, but that was a good way of using them to suss out the jokes that I'd find funny, and the jokes that make me want to shake my head. If you go onto the Comedy Central website these days, and checked their schedule, it appears they don't seem to play these types of movies as much anymore. Instead, they pivoted post-streaming to becoming more of a South Park, Seinfeld, Futurama, The Office rerun channel. Still, there's a bit of a charm to a Comedy Central movie staple, a very subpar film that I just happened to watch several times in bits and pieces as a kid. Generally, it was nothing to write home about, but sometimes bad simplicity at a particular time is all you really need. Anyway, see ya!
You don't. You do? You don't. You do? You don't. You do? You don't. No, that's cool. You don't have to. No, you don't. Just do your own thing. I'm up here. You're down there. That's cool.